Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
For years ago, I sat alone in my car outside a Walgreens with the engine off and my phone clutched so tight my knuckles had gone white, staring at the screen like it might offer me some kind of salvation. My checking account was at $17 and change, rent was due in 5 days, and I had exactly zero safety net left. No savings. No partner. No backup plan. Just the hope, thin, shaky, and humiliating, that maybe this time, my parents would actually show up for me. I remember dialing their number with a pit in my stomach, knowing I was about to hear the kind of disappointment that wears a smile and calls itself tough love. My mother picked up, cheerful as ever at first, asking how I was, how work was going, whether I'd heard that my sister Amy just got engaged at Lake Tahoe with a 3-carat diamond and a drone video proposal. I remember swallowing a mouthful of pride so bitter it stuck in my throat, and answering as calmly as I could that I wasn't calling to catch up, that I needed help. Just a little. Just enough to get me through the month. I told her about the emergency room bill I hadn't expected, about the freelance clients that hadn't paid on time, about the landlord's new zero-tolerance policy for late rent. And I said the words that took me a full hour of pacing in my apartment to work up the nerve to say, I need help covering rent this month. Just this once. There was a pause on the other end. Not a dramatic gasp or a shocked silence. Just the kind of pause that told me she'd already decided before I even asked. Then came her voice, too soft to be comforting, too flat to be caring. Oh honey, we just can't. Things are tight right now with the wedding coming up and the market being what it is. You know we love you, but we've all got to make smart choices. Smart choices. As if I'd blown my money on booze or lottery tickets. As if I'd somehow chosen to need them. I hung up a few minutes later, thanked them anyway, and stared straight ahead through the windshield, watching the world move around me like I was outside of it, disconnected, invisible. I didn't cry right away. Not until I saw a mother and her daughter walk past my car holding hands and laughing about some inside joke only they knew. That's when it cracked. That's when everything inside me split into this cold, quiet kind of grief that didn't make noise, but changed me forever. The thing is, I wasn't asking for a miracle. I wasn't some lifelong screw-up or black sheep. I had been the dependable one, the kid who got herself to school every day, held part-time jobs since 16, skipped parties to help with chores when my dad got laid off, and never, not once, threw my mistakes in anyone's face. I had always cleaned up after myself. Always been the one who called home, remembered birthdays, showed up to every family thing, even when I could barely afford the gas to get there. But Amy? Amy could miss a family Christmas because her dog had a spa appointment, and our parents would still defend her like she was royalty. She's busy, sweetie. Don't be jealous of your sister's success. You two just have different paths. That was the line every time. Different paths. 3 weeks after that phone call, when I was still eating canned soup and microwaving day-old coffee, I saw Amy's post on Facebook. It was a sunny photo of her and Greg, her fiancé, standing in front of a big suburban house with "sold" written in bold red letters across a plastic sign. Her caption read, "1,000 thank yous to Mom and Dad for the best wedding gift ever. Our mortgage is gone." Feeling so blessed. I stared at the screen so long my hand went numb. I didn't rage. I didn't scream. I didn't even comment. I just sat there with this horrible, hollow feeling in my chest like someone had scooped out the last bit of belief I had in what family meant. It wasn't the money though, God knows, I needed it more than they did. It was the lie. The blatant, quiet lie. They could help. They just didn't want to help me. That night, I deleted the Facebook app from my phone. I didn't want to see another filtered photo of Amy's brunch or my mother's motivational quotes about gratitude and hard work. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, replaying every time I'd taken a back seat to make life easier for someone else. Every time I'd stepped aside without protest. Every time I'd told myself that being the strong one meant swallowing the hurt and pretending I was okay. But I wasn't okay. And for the first time in my life, I stopped trying to be. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do next, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I would never, ever ask them for anything again. Not a dollar. Not advice. Not approval. I was done playing the role of the forgotten daughter. If they couldn't see my worth when I had nothing, they damn well wouldn't get to stand next to me when I finally had something. I remember saying it out loud, just once, to no one but the dark. You want to treat me like I don't exist? Fine. Watch what I do with that. And that's when everything started to change. Not fast. Not loud. But real. Because I wasn't going to beg anymore. I was going to build. And when I was done, they wouldn't recognize the person I'd become. Not until it was too late. The day the final rent notice arrived, it came in a plain white envelope slid halfway under my apartment door. The kind landlords use when they're too cowardly to face you, but still want the dignity of acting professional. And I remember the way my heart beat too fast before I even opened it, because by then I had memorized the tone of that kind of paper, clinical, indifferent, as if my home, my safety, and my peace of mind were just lines on a spreadsheet being processed by someone who would never have to worry about a bounce check or a late fee cascading into a full-blown crisis. I opened it slowly, hoping for some extension, some acknowledgement that I'd never missed a payment before, but of course, there was nothing personal in it, just the cold facts. Rent overdue by 21 days, late fee now added. And unless I brought it current within the next 5, the process to terminate my lease would begin. I stared at the letter for a long time, my hands starting to shake slightly, not from fear exactly, but from that dull kind of exhaustion that builds when you've been trying too hard for too long without a single break. And for a moment I felt the familiar panic rising, the same panic I'd felt the month before when my temp contract at the agency didn't get renewed. And again when I checked my bank account and realized I couldn't even afford to go to a doctor when my lower back seized up from stress and I had to crawl to the bathroom on my hands and knees because standing was no longer an option. The idea of being evicted was terrifying, but what scared me more was the thought of having to make that phone call, to admit, again, that I'd failed. To ask for help when I already knew the answer. But I made it anyway, partly because I had no one else, and partly because some foolish, stubborn piece of me still believed that maybe this time would be different. Maybe the shame in my voice would be enough. Maybe my mother would finally hear it, understand it, and remember that I was her daughter too, not just the one who didn't make waves, but the one who used to stay home and clean while Amy went out with friends, who helped cook Thanksgiving dinner while everyone else watched football, who quietly got straight A's and never once asked for recognition. I dialed with my thumb pressed into the center of my palm like that would keep me steady, and when my father picked up, I could already tell from the sound of his voice that the conversation was going to go exactly the way I feared. He started with the usual pleasantries, asking how I was holding up, if I'd applied for new jobs, if I was staying safe with all this craziness going on. I didn't answer any of that. I told him directly, without sugarcoating, that I was facing eviction, that I'd hit a wall, that I needed a loan, nothing huge, just enough to cover this month's rent and keep me afloat while I found something stable. I told him I'd pay it back, that I could even sign something if that made him feel better, and I waited, holding my breath, because this was my last option and I was placing it all in their hands, again, even though they had already shown me what those hands looked like when I was in need. His sigh was deep, not angry but tired, like I was a task on a to-do list he didn't want to complete. He said, and I'll never forget this, that he and my mother had talked about boundaries and how they didn't want to create a pattern of financial dependency, which sounded rehearsed and self-congratulatory, as if denying help to their struggling daughter was some noble act of parenting instead of the act of quiet abandonment it really was. He told me, sweetie, we just can't keep bailing you out. You've got to figure things out. You're not a kid anymore. The phrase bailing you out struck me like a slap, because I had never asked them for anything before. Not when I put myself through college on scholarships and part-time jobs, not when I worked double shifts after my breakup to afford a U-Haul and get away from a man who once screamed at me so loud the neighbors called the cops. Not even when I skipped medical checkups for 3 years straight because I didn't have insurance and didn't want to worry anyone. But in his mind, this one desperate ask was bailing me out. And that's when I knew, beyond any doubt, that I wasn't part of their safety net, not really. I was the one expected to land on my feet, no matter the fall. I was the fallback for everyone else, but when I fell, there was no one behind me. I hung up, numb and ashamed, and sat in silence in the middle of my apartment, surrounded by walls that had started to feel more like enemies than shelter. Outside, kids were screaming on the sidewalk, playing some game I couldn't name, and in the distance I could hear a siren wailing toward some emergency more urgent than mine. I reached for my laptop on instinct, opened Facebook, and there she was, Amy, glowing and golden as always, on a beach somewhere in Maui, posing with a drink and tagging Greg with a caption that said something idiotic like, "Living our best lives. Cheers to adulting." I stared at the picture and felt something inside me click. Not snap. Just shift. Like a gear finally finding the right teeth. I thought about the stories we tell ourselves to make other people's choices easier to stomach. That they didn't mean it. That they're doing their best. That love is complicated. But the truth is, love without effort isn't love, it's convenience. And I'd spent too long being the convenient daughter. The one who didn't complain. The one who kept the peace. The one who got left behind while everyone else moved forward. I stood up, walked to the closet, pulled out the cheap suitcase I used for business trips back when I had an office job, and began filling it with what little I cared to keep. Clothes. Documents. My laptop. One framed photo of me and my grandmother, who'd passed before I learned what being invisible really felt like. I didn't even leave a note. There was no one to read it. At 2:30 in the morning, I carried that suitcase down 3 flights of stairs and didn't look back. I didn't know where I was going yet, but I knew one thing for certain. If I was ever going to get back up, I had to disappear first. Not for attention. Not to punish anyone. But to build something none of them would see coming. Something they would only recognize once it was standing tall above them, silent, cold, and permanent. And I wouldn't tell a soul. There's a strange kind of liberation that comes not when things finally go right, but when they fall apart so completely, so quietly, that the noise of your own failure fades into something almost serene, like a hum at the back of your throat that says, "Now you've got nothing left to lose." That was what I felt during those first hours on the road out of Illinois, the state I was born in, raised in, and slowly abandoned by, and as I crossed out of that flat, familiar horizon into something unknown, I wasn't filled with hope or even fear. I was simply emptied out, like a glass that had finally been drained dry. It was not a dramatic moment, not the climax of some epic story. I just drove. No music. No podcasts. Just the sound of the tires gripping the road and my mind, quiet for the first time in months, deciding that if no one was coming to save me, then I would start over somewhere no one knew my name. I landed in Milwaukee not because it was part of some brilliant plan or lifelong dream, but because a former coworker, and in turn I had mentored back when I still had energy to care about people's potential, responded to my text about needing a couch for a few nights. His name was Dan, and he was one of those rare people who doesn't ask too many questions when you show up at their door with a suitcase, sunken eyes, and a story you're not quite ready to tell. He had a small studio in a walk-up near the Marquette campus, filled with books and the kind of chaos that only 20-something bachelor life can produce, and when I collapsed on his faded futon with a borrowed blanket and a bag of pretzels for dinner, I didn't feel safe exactly, but I felt invisible in the way I needed to be, unseen, unjudged, and momentarily still. The next few weeks were a blur of small humiliations wrapped in larger acts of quiet defiance. I picked up a job at a 24-hour diner 2 miles from Dan's place, bussing tables and learning how to refill coffee without spilling it, and another at a self-storage facility where I worked overnight shifts surrounded by rows of locked-up lives that somehow mirrored my own, abandoned items, forgotten spaces, things people didn't want but couldn't quite let go of. I lived off tips, gas station sandwiches, and the kind of exhaustion that blurs day and night into one long, greasy film. But for all the misery, there was something honest about it. I wasn't pretending anymore. I wasn't performing gratitude I didn't feel or faking stability I couldn't sustain. I was just surviving, and in that survival, I found the one thing I'd been missing for years: control. I began to teach myself things in the dead hours between shifts, when the air felt thick with a kind of desperate calm that only those who have hit rock bottom can understand. I borrowed Dan's old laptop when he wasn't using it and watched YouTube videos on real estate basics, read free ebooks on investing and passive income, and even signed up for a few free Zoom seminars that promised nothing and usually delivered even less, but gave me structure, gave me something to sink my teeth into when my hands weren't scraping grime from diner tables or stacking boxes in a silent, fluorescent-lit warehouse. Every dollar I didn't need for survival went into a high-yield savings account I'd set up with a bank that didn't even have a branch in the city. I didn't want convenience. I wanted distance from everything I had known and everyone who had failed to know me. Dan never asked why I worked 2 jobs, why I disappeared for 16 hours at a time, or why I sometimes came home and sat in the bathroom with the shower running just so I could cry without being heard. He had his own life, and I think he sensed that I was building something, though he didn't know what. In truth, I didn't know either. I only knew that whatever it was, it had to be mine. Not inherited. Not gifted. Not granted by someone who thought they held power over me because of blood or birthright. It had to be carved from scratch, with hands that had once begged for help and now refused to open except to build. By the end of that first year, I had saved just under $8,000, nothing in the grand scheme of things, but enough to buy into a small investment group I had found through one of the mentors in an online forum. They were scrappy, young, and mostly male, but they had flipped 3 properties in under 12 months and were looking for a silent partner who didn't need a seat at the table, just a stake. I didn't tell them where I came from, and they didn't ask. I wired the money and held my breath. 3 months later, the first return came through. It wasn't massive, but it was real. Tangible. Proof that I could convert pain into strategy. From there, things moved faster, not because I rushed, but because I no longer hesitated. I stopped looking over my shoulder. I stopped checking Facebook. I stopped wondering if anyone from home was thinking about me or worrying or regretting what they'd said or failed to say. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger requires a kind of energy I no longer had. What I felt instead was focus. Cold, sharp, relentless focus. The second property was a duplex on the edge of town that I helped manage part-time in exchange for a bigger cut. I painted walls. I cleaned floors. I dealt with tenants who screamed about broken water heaters and clogged drains. I didn't mind. Every argument, every smudge of grime under my fingernails, every sleepless night spent reviewing spreadsheets and watching markets, it all built into something bigger. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was accumulating. And then, one afternoon while scrolling listings out of habit more than intent, I saw an address that stopped me cold, not because of the numbers, or the condition, or the price, but because I recognized it. The building wasn't fancy. In fact, it looked tired, with a faded awning and cracked steps and the kind of paint job that said the landlord hadn't cared in years. But I knew those steps. I knew that street. I knew that awning, because 2 years ago, when I still lived within driving distance, I had driven my parents there to drop off moving boxes after they sold their house and downsized. They said they were tired of maintaining a yard and wanted to simplify their lives. What they didn't say, and what I only learned later through a relative's offhand comment, was that they had used a portion of the sale proceeds to cover part of Amy's honeymoon, calling it their way of showing love. There it was. The building my parents now called home. A 12-unit complex with aging infrastructure and tenants who mostly paid in cash. It was up for sale, under market, with deferred maintenance and a seller who had clearly lost interest in keeping it alive. It needed work. It needed money. It needed someone to care. And I smiled. Because for the first time, I realized that the silence I had cultivated, the vanishing act I had performed, the endless hours of scraping by and building up, they had led me here. To this moment. To this listing. And without a word, without a second thought, I reached for my phone, dialed my broker, and said 6 words I never thought I'd say. I want to buy that building. From the moment my offer was accepted, I carried myself with the kind of stillness that comes not from arrogance, but from the deep and private satisfaction of someone who has spent years swallowing disappointment like broken glass and finally tastes the metallic bite of justice, subtle, silent, and so sharp it nearly drew blood. The building, with its flaking paint and half-working mailboxes and lobby that smelled like forgotten mildew and overcooked cabbage, wasn't the kind of property that impressed on sight and to most people. Especially those who'd never had to choose between food and a late fee. It might have seemed like a tired liability barely worth the paperwork it came with. But to me, it wasn't just a 12-unit apartment complex in the tired middle of a gray neighborhood. It was a stage. And I was going to rewrite the entire play, this time as the one holding the script. The sale moved faster than I expected, partly because I had done all the groundwork ahead of time, securing financing through a commercial lender who didn't care about personal stories, only numbers, and partly because the former owner, a 72-year-old man named Ron who had inherited the building from a cousin and let it rot out of apathy more than malice, was desperate to offload it before the end of the fiscal year. He asked no questions about the LLC I had filed under a business name that gave away nothing personal, didn't blink at the inspection report I'd insisted on, and when we signed the final documents in a beige office with cheap coffee and fluorescent lighting, he slid the keys across the table with a shrug and said, "She's all yours now, kid. Good luck." He didn't realize I didn't need luck. I had something far better: purpose. A quiet one. A patient one. I didn't make any grand declarations or celebratory posts. I didn't tell Dan or the few acquaintances I had left in Milwaukee. I didn't even mark the date in my calendar. Because this wasn't about celebrating a win, it was about completion. About full-circle silence. About finishing a story that had begun the day I was told, over the phone, by the man who once held my hand across a busy street, that helping me pay rent was not a smart financial move. The first time I visited the building as its owner, I did it in plain jeans and a faded jacket, no clipboard, no fanfare, just a notebook in my pocket and a pen to jot down what needed to be fixed. I walked the halls slowly, nodding at the peeling baseboards, the dim bulbs, the faint smell of cheap detergent that clung to the laundry room like resignation, and when I passed Unit 4, the one at the end of the hall, with the dented door frame and the crooked welcome mat that had faded into illegibility, I felt a curious calm settle over me. My mother had sent me a photo months earlier of the new cozy place she and my father had moved into, smiling on a balcony that now stood 2 feet behind the door I was standing in front of. I didn't knock. I didn't even linger. I simply took note of the loose hinge on the railing and moved on, every step heavier not with dread, but with confirmation that the plan I had birthed in hunger and shame was now a living, breathing reality. Over the next 3 months, I worked with methodical intention, not just to improve the property, but to do so in a way that no one, especially not tenants like my parents, would suspect who was behind the changes. I hired a local management company I'd researched for weeks, one that dealt directly with tenants and acted as a buffer, keeping my name and face entirely off the table. I approved every line item in their reports, paid for new paint in the hallways, installed security cameras, replaced the broken laundry units, and greenlit small cosmetic upgrades that gave the place a fresher look without sending up red flags that a new owner was looking to flip and evict. I wasn't interested in cruelty. I was interested in precision. What fascinated me most was how my parents responded to the changes, not to me, but to the building. Through a family group chat I still hadn't left, but never spoken, Amy mentioned that Mom says their new landlord is finally fixing the place up, and my father chimed in that it was about time someone cared about the property. I read the message in silence, then placed my phone face down on the counter and went back to reviewing the budget proposal for replacing the windows in Units 3, 5, and 7. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just noted, quietly, that they still had no idea. On my second visit, unannounced and mid-morning when most tenants were at work or sleeping off third-shift jobs, I crossed paths with my father in the stairwell. He was coming up, holding a broom in one hand and a plastic bag in the other, muttering something about the kids from Unit 10 leaving wrappers all over the stoop again. For a moment, I froze, not in fear, but in calculation. He looked older than I remembered. Thinner. His shoulders stooped not from age, but from something more permanent, regret, maybe, though I couldn't be sure. He didn't recognize me. Didn't glance twice. Just shuffled past with the kind of absent courtesy you give a neighbor you barely register. And in that moment, I understood something profound. I had already disappeared from their narrative. Not out of cruelty, but out of habit. I was no longer a daughter to them, not in the way Amy still was. I was a shadow in the family scrapbook, someone mentioned briefly at holidays, if at all. And that was fine. It made everything easier. Because a few days later, when the property manager called and asked if I wanted to adjust rents for the upcoming lease cycle, citing market rates and maintenance increases, I paused, not because I wasn't ready, but because I wanted to get the words exactly right. Yes, I said, steady and calm. Raise the rent on Unit 4. Send it by certified mail. There was no malice in my voice. No trembling. Just a firmness I had earned the hard way, through every shift, every unpaid invoice, every half-eaten dinner in a room where no one asked how I was doing. I wasn't seeking revenge. I wasn't hoping they'd suffer. I just wanted balance. The kind they never thought I deserved. I later heard, again, through the digital grapevine of Amy's overactive messaging, that my parents were shocked by the increase, complained that it was unfair, especially to loyal tenants like them, and had spent an entire afternoon calling the management company trying to plead their case. They didn't get through, of course. The manager had strict orders not to reveal any details about ownership, and he followed them to the letter. What struck me most wasn't their frustration. It was the entitlement underneath it, the assumption that they should be exempt, that loyalty meant comfort, that time earned you immunity. I wondered if they had ever felt that way about me, even once. But I didn't dwell on it. Instead, I walked the property again that evening, alone, my boots crunching over the thin frost beginning to creep across the sidewalk. And I looked up at the second-floor balcony where I knew they sometimes sat with mugs of instant coffee and talked about the news or the neighbor's noisy dog or whatever else occupied their world. They were just silhouettes now. Small figures in a life I no longer needed to explain. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel small. The letter arrived in the kind of envelope my parents had grown used to receiving, clean, generic, and stamped with a logo they wouldn't recognize, printed with ink that told them, in terms far too polite for what it really meant, that life was about to get just a little more expensive, a little more uncomfortable, and that the place they had grown so content in, the place they had called a good little spot for retirement, was changing under their feet in ways they hadn't anticipated and could no longer control. I knew when it would land in their mailbox, down to the hour, because I had instructed the property manager to send it by certified mail with tracking. I wasn't interested in drama or confrontation. I simply wanted certainty, the same certainty they once gave me when they said no without hesitation or apology. There's something profoundly symmetrical about quiet justice, and I had learned to appreciate symmetry over the years, symmetry in memory, in consequence, in silence. They didn't call me, of course. Not directly. That would have required a kind of humility I no longer expected from people who had always chosen comfort over confrontation, denial over reflection. Instead, the call came from Amy, whose number lit up my screen 2 days later at 10:37 in the morning, while I was reviewing estimates for plumbing repairs in another building across town. I didn't answer immediately. I watched the phone ring, watched her name flash against the screen like an echo from a life that no longer belonged to me, and I waited until the voicemail alert popped up before I listened to her voice, overly sweet and too carefully composed, like someone trying to pretend everything was casual when it was anything but. She said Mom and Dad were a little upset about the rent increase, that it had caught them by surprise, and that they didn't understand why it had gone up by such a significant percentage all at once. She said she knew I probably didn't care, that I was off living some mysterious new life, but she thought I should know they were struggling a bit and didn't really have the extra income to adjust. She said they felt blindsided. That word, blindsided, hit me in the gut, not with guilt, but with recognition. Because that was exactly how I had felt when they left me alone in that parking lot with $17 and a lease I couldn't pay, when they paid off Amy's mortgage and told me they couldn't afford to help me keep a roof over my head, when they decided that family support had to be earned like a prize and that I hadn't been good enough to win it. I didn't respond to Amy. I didn't need to. I knew she'd call again. And she did 3 days later, her tone more urgent, less polished, slipping in a note about how it's just hard to watch them struggle when they've always been there for us, and that if I knew anything about the new landlord, maybe I could help them out or at least give them some advice. That message made me laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd to think that the same people who taught me to pull myself up by my bootstraps were now looking for the string someone else could tug to save them. And still, I said nothing. A week after that, my father called. That call I answered, not out of obligation, but out of curiosity, because I wondered how his voice would sound when it was no longer wrapped in the authority he used to carry like a shield. It was strange hearing him hesitate, hearing the man who once told me I had to toughen up now speak in soft, strained syllables, as if every word cost him a little pride. He didn't mention the past. He didn't bring up the wedding gift or the rent call or the silence in between. He simply asked, flatly, if I knew who the new owner was, if I had any connections in real estate, if there was anything I could do. I told him I'd look into it. I told him I'd see what I could find out. And I hung up calmly, with the sound of his discomfort echoing in my ears like a song I hadn't realized I'd memorized. The truth is, I had no intention of lowering the rent or granting favors. I wasn't going to evict them or put them out on the street. This wasn't about cruelty or revenge dressed in theatrical gestures. But I also wasn't going to make their lives easier just because they suddenly found themselves on the losing end of someone else's decision. For years, I had begged quietly, lived humbly, and suffered silently while they pretended to love me with the same breath they used to excuse their favoritism. And now, the power had shifted, not with screaming or vengeance, but with signed contracts and legal ownership and the kind of influence that never needs to announce itself to be felt. They had handed me the blueprint of what indifference looked like. I had simply followed it, brick by brick, until I built the kind of foundation they could live under without ever seeing the architect's name. Sometimes, I wonder if they suspect anything. If, late at night when the new mailbox locks are harder to open or the common area lights flicker in patterns they never used to, they think about who's really behind the changes. If they consider the fact that their once silent daughter, the one who didn't cry at family fights or throw tantrums over birthdays forgotten, might have grown into someone who didn't need to yell to be heard. But then I see Amy's photos online, still full of brunches and tropical vacations and group shots where I am always missing, and I realize they probably don't. Because people like that rarely look back unless they're forced to, and I had no interest in forcing anyone to see what they refuse to acknowledge. I still pass the building sometimes, not out of nostalgia, but as a reminder of what I came from, of what I built, and of how power doesn't always look like rage or revenge. Sometimes, it looks like walking past the second-floor window where your parents sit with their coffee and not feeling the need to wave. Sometimes, it looks like silence that echoes louder than any confrontation ever could. They never found out. Or if they did, they never said a word. And I never told them. Because at the end of it all, this wasn't about them. It was about me. And I had finally, completely, and without apology, stopped asking for permission to live my life on my own terms. Even if that life happened to include raising the rent.